In this episode, we discuss the backlash to Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey and consider whether it's driven by ignorance or something a little more sinister. Hello, welcome to the Call Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and joining me today is a man whose best is hit with a shebang. Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, are you ready to show us why you're cool enough to be the Iceman?
Yeah, man. Shebang. It's putting a lot on me today, man. So, audience, get ready.
All right. We're recording on August 4th. And before we get started, if you enjoy the show, I ask you to subscribe, like the show on YouTube or your podcast app. Doing so really helps the show out. So, Tunde, we know that Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey has been one of the stories of the 2026 summer. At this point, its total worldwide box office is approaching $1 billion, making it one of the biggest R-rated movies in history. And it generally has gotten universal acclaim. But as with everything, there's been a segment of people that are loudly upset about it. And one of the segments of people that were, were loudly upset, you had some historians and saying, oh, this interpretation is a little different than the one that I would have done or something like that. But one of the segments of people that were loudly upset about this were upset predictably in some degree, because when you look at other fantasy things like Star Wars and stuff, but they were upset because there were black actors in it and playing, prominent roles or roles that mattered, not just people in the background. And this was based, they say at least, based on the idea that, this is about a story from ancient Greece. And so it's not historically accurate to have black actors and so forth. Now, considering how close Greece is to Africa and how well documented it is that people were going back and forth between Greece and Ethiopia and Egypt and all that stuff for thousands of years, this seems to be quite misinformed, thinking that, there wouldn't be people with darker skin complexion in Greece at that time. But nonetheless, it made me think of something else. In George Orwell's book, 1984, there's a quote that may also help explain what we're seeing. The quote is, who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. So I wanted to ask you, regarding this Odyssey backlash over the inclusion of black characters, do you think that these folks are knowingly try to, quote, own the past, in an Orwellian sense, or are they just ignorant, and misinformed as far as the history of the Mediterranean?
That's a great question, man. I would say it's a bit of both, to be honest with you. I think
a little from column A, a little from column B.
Yeah, I would say this. I think the backlash, maybe by some online and the majority, I would lean towards the ignorance and the misinformed, on history and about how humanity has kind of worked, right? For thousands of years. And like you're saying, Greece is. I think I got this from you. Greece is closer to Africa, the continent, and Egypt and all that than it is to England. So there's a huge sea, which was an easy way for people to travel for thousands of years.
Yeah, so much easier to get there too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's not a big mountain range called the Alps in the way, right? Like on a serious note,
and a bunch of barbarians trying to kill you and all that other stuff. It's open sea.
Oh, hey,
now there may be giants.
Don't go calling people. Hey, don't be calling people names, man. But I think what you identify as you were talking, it helped me realize, because when you mentioned the internet, I was like, yeah, you know what? The problem is that the internet is a place where grievance has been trafficked, and at least in this early part of the internet's existence, let's say the last generation, it seems like grievance, the kind of concept of misery loving company, all that is where the internet likes to swim, and so. I appreciate, like, you bringing up the numbers, that it's almost at $1 billion. It's been out like 2 weeks. The box office, the number one R-rated film ever in box office hits. So clearly, with non-black people being the majority of this country, let's just put it that way. Obviously, the numbers, the money made from this movie has been because a majority of non-black people have been watching it. So that's, to me, I would say that's a positive reality, the numbers. But I think the internet, unfortunately, magnifies these voices in a way that we all have to then kind of deal with that too in our society. And I think I'll leave it at this, James, with this comment. I feel good and kind of pleasantly surprised at this one, that it seems like the traction we've been seeing in recent years, but all this anti-woke and kind of this desire to always put down something that is either non-white or whatever, right? Like that stuff.
Just
Western
be mad
civilization.
if something isn't either completely white or just totally white centered.
Correct. Yeah, I feel like this movie, for whatever this time, it feels a bit different. People don't seem to be responding to that energy in the way that they have in the past, and I think that's a good thing for the rest of us.
No, that's interesting thought. I think I would say I would agree with you actually that it's a little bit of both. Like if you see government officials trying to peddle stuff like this, I think there are people like that are out there trying to own the past, and saying, ridiculous things like from a historical standpoint, the Mediterranean is its own thing, like what was happening in Greece and Egypt and the Phoenicians and all this other stuff for thousands of years. That was its own thing. That wasn't quote unquote Europe. In the sense that we think about it now. So I think that there are people who are trying to claim, and this has happened for a long time, who are trying to claim what Greece was doing, which many note that really a lot of that came from Egypt. But setting that aside, what Greece was doing as, hey, this is Western, this is Europe, this is that kind of thing. So I think that effort is being made, but I think the vast majority of it is people that are just ignorant. And I don't think that any of them are being genuine, because what's always struck me about this, whether it be, the Star Wars stuff or, like these fantasy things that are made up, fiction, and how people will say, oh, well, the characters need to look like this or they need to look like that. Is like, and people these folks, this segment of people get so worked up about that. But yet these people don't get worked up about the idea that, hey, is a real historical figure like Jesus, is he being accurately represented in terms of where he was from and all that type of stuff? Is the visuals that we see of him accurate? And this is a real person, versus, so these people want to claim what fantasy, what things out of people's imagination have to look like, but they don't object to what a real person, if they're portrayed in a way that wouldn't be historically accurate. So I think they're not genuine. And so hopefully what we're seeing, and obviously this is going to be a little bit more going on than what we're actually seeing, but some people are always mad about something, like law 10, 48 laws of power, avoid the unhappy and the unlucky, so maybe what you're observing is that, okay, people are getting kind of tired of this act. I don't know if that's the case, but at minimum, I advise people when I talk to people, it's like, look, you got to understand when somebody's just a mad person or an angry person or just always has something that they're complaining about, you need to kind of be away from those people because they'll just make you mad like them. That's kind of that stuff transfers, you know what I'm saying? And so to me, they're either pushing some sinister agenda or they're ignorant and just mad. Their ignorance allows them to be mad, but they're all disingenuous as far as this goes because these people don't care about historical accuracy. If they want to play this game, say what they're about. They want to claim all history as white European. Just say that. And then we can have the argument or the discussion or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, and that last comment even shows to their ignorance about Europe. I mean, this idea of white Europeans is a myth. Europe
it's a recent invention. It's the last couple hundred years that they came up with that idea because you go back a couple hundred years and the Eastern Europeans weren't, or the Western Europeans didn't think of themselves as the same as the Eastern Europeans. Yeah. And then we can go back even further with the Franks and all this. And then there's a lot of stuff. Even if you just look at Great Britain, like there's the Wales, the Scottish, there's a lot of people that are like, hey, until recently looked at themselves as very different.
Yeah, well, that's a different thing when you know more about the history of Europeans than some of these people in America that claim to know European history. Like you said, the Franks, the Rus, the Visigoths, all that stuff. And these people are pretty ignorant to the fact of that type of what I would call beautiful diversity, right, in humanity. It's kind of like the Middle Eastern tribes of the Alawites and Persians and all that, or the African tribes like my dad was Yoruba, and that's different than Hausa and Igbo. And so the reality is it's all the same from that standpoint, but people, like you said, the misinformation and kind of, I think part of it is just the culture of eugenics from the late 1800s to the early 1900s really changed the way the Western world in terms of European descendants in Europe and around the world, like Australia, Canada, and the United States, those people looked at themselves, and I think part of it was the
I don't know, man,
justification.
because remember in eugenics, the Eastern Europeans were one of the bottom people, like that. So
Yeah.
I don't know, but I get your point. Your point is well made, but they're not even following the eugenics stuff really either.
Well, that's because it's all about power, right? And so
there we go.
When you've got
powerful, feeling better, feel that. Yeah, but go ahead.
Yeah, because we've lived through it. I mean, when I was a kid, to be white was to be what was considered a WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That's very direct, right? That's not Slavic. That's not Italian. That's not Greek, right? And today, like we did this show on the 2020 census, they allow Egyptians and Greeks and Italians to classify in the American census as Caucasian. And that wasn't happening when I was a kid. The Italians
that was the way they were supposed to classify. That wasn't it wasn't they weren't allowing them. They were saying, hey, this is what you're supposed to do. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's what I mean is the idea that's why the idea of race is really about power and proximity to power. And and that's kind of what I'm saying is I realize in preparing for this discussion, this is just all an offshoot of kind of the history of colonialism in recent hundreds of years. And by the kind of period of Darwin and writing his great book about the origin of species in the late 1800s, there's certain people took that culturally and said, okay, well, this, the fact that we got railroads and stuff like this means that white people, quote unquote, must be the most dominant, this Darwinian look, and saying that other humans aren't equal or as good. And when you have that kind of indoctrination, because remember, prior to the Holocaust of the Second World War ending in the middle of the 20th century, 1945, we had eugenics taught in Ivy League schools in the United States. And we had a president, Woodrow Wilson, who was president of Princeton University prior to being president of the United States, who taught eugenics at Princeton and who was a firm believer in it. And he was the guy that segregated the federal government in the 19 teens. So again, this is the part of history that gets swept under the rug, just like Reconstruction, that no one wants to talk about. And here we are 100 years later, and we don't talk about the influence of this type of thinking onto the modern culture of today. And that's where I think, James, this is crashing up against that reality that history is not what these people have fantasized it to be. And as those realities begin to play out, they're going to have an issue with identity. And we're going to see it play out.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, that was the effort to own the past at that time, and so
it's a good point, about the Orwellian.
Yeah, and so owning the past was important to them at that time, and like that, it makes sense that it wouldn't just go away magically now. But here's the question I have for you, kind of rubber meeting the road. For some things, the idea, like the United States, at least from a cultural standpoint, has it been able to get past this stuff to kind of advance and move past the need of some to kind of justify their own self-worth by claiming these old things and stuff like that. Do you think this is something, that, America would ever be able to outgrow? And with I would point to sports as an example where we've seen over 100 years or 120 years a change in how Americans view themselves in relation to sports. If you go back 120 years, it was very important to the majority group to be superior in athletics as well, and so and many efforts were taken to make sure that was kind of that people couldn't see anything that would challenge that. This is what, you got the Negro leagues separate from the major leagues, you had boxing, all these places where sports were popular, effort was taken to make sure that they didn't mix so that nobody could ever challenge or question whether or not the majority was a superior group. But integration happened with that stuff and the world didn't end and people kind of just, moved on. It wasn't like something that every time a black guy wins the heavyweight championship or a black guy, is playing a sport, it's like, oh my gosh, this is some crisis. What's happening? This isn't historically accurate. So do you think this kind of thing is something that people would ever be able to get by? And I know we want to wrap up, so get your thought and I'll throw in.
That's a good question, James. And I want to think more positive. I'm going to say no. But I'd like to think more positive. I'm being serious, and I'll explain why.
I got you.
As you're talking,
I laugh because I can see you're struggling with the answer.
No, but I wrote down the name Jesse Owens from 1936 as you were talking, because you're right. I mean, again, we're starting to get obviously more removed from this history. We're talking 90 years ago now in 1936. So we weren't alive. Most people listening to this wouldn't have been alive. And so, but the idea was that was still during the height of eugenics culture. You know, the Nazis were just kind of starting in their reign and their power. By then, they had been in power for 3 years in Germany. And you had the 1936 Berlin Olympics, which was touted as, Germany was going to show the rest of the world how these Aryans were so superior. And like you're saying, James, back then it was superior in all ways, in meaning all ways that they were superior. So Jesse Owens, being a Black American sprinter, was, for people that don't know that history, blew a hole in that whole thing because he beat the Aryan German sprinter. And it was like, well, you guys aren't superior this way. So, James, that's the part we didn't live through, right? We grew up with now them still trying to say that, oh, well, we're superior mentally and all this. And again, we have a Black man become president in the United States. And I'll say this in a positive way. Obviously, he won both elections fairly and cleanly. And the second one was a landslide historic with a lot of, white American support. But he also disturbed enough people with his presence in that position that I think that, other actors that might not have had the same goals for the long-term direction of the country in terms of, the big middle class and the New Deal and all that, were able to kind of hijack it along the way and take us to where we are today, where the system is being unraveled. So that's why I say, James, I don't know, because you have a United States that's founded on cultural memes like Manifest Destiny, like Christian nationalism, and a lot of things that do incorporate, for a lot of Americans, not all of them, but the idea that this is a white Christian country. And you and I saw an article in a study that showed that 40% of white Americans today believe in the Great Replacement theory. So if you are a country that has 40% of the majority group basing the country on what they feel is their racial identity, and the country is continuing to change demographically, I don't know if that can be uncoupled from the American story, so I don't know. That's what I
Interesting.
say. Sorry for the rant.
Skeptical.
That was long.
You're skeptical that it can be, and I can appreciate that. Whether it will happen or not, I'll be optimistic and say yes. And I have a specific reason. It's not blind optimism. I think that if you take too narrow of a view, there's always progress and backlash. That goes back even the Dr. King book that we did. Where do we go from here? He talks about that. So the progress, backlash is a normal part of the American experience. And if you look at what was going on in the 19 teens, you could say that America's dealt pretty well. We haven't had these huge riots of people and then people getting lynched and all that kind of stuff in the way that we did, in the 19 teens and early 20s and so forth, in the backlash to other things that were going on. So, in that sense, the backlash that we may be living through right now would be less severe, less extreme. So, but the reason I would say that I'm more optimistic on this than you is that I think the path to doing this has already been shown and already been established. And you brought up a great example of this, Jesse Owens. One thing that I do think that, let me back up. The way you would be able to overcome this or outgrow this as a nation, as a culture, people need something to feel good about. That I think is the established part. And so what is offered to many in the majority group to feel good about is race right now. And that's compelling, that's overwhelming for some of them. And so they latch on to that. The bigger issue may be that they're not being offered other things to feel good about. And so maybe once Americans, like nationalism is another thing. That nationalism can take negative turns, but nationalism also can be used to bring large numbers of people together. And, Jesse Owens, that's a nationalism thing. Americans, and by and large, we're happy to see Jesse Owens won, even though it was a racist country at that time. Well, it was a racist country. Even though it was a racist country, but that was because of nationalism. That was because, hey, that's our guy, so to speak. So I do think there are what would have to happen is that skillful politicians who don't want to take the system apart, or maybe who want to hold the system together, hold the country together, would have to give people things to feel good about. Nationalism can be one. Hey, building the largest middle class was another. Building the largest middle class in the world, and then you end up having the civil rights movement, and it works. Like, so there are other things you can give people to feel good about. The issue that we run into a lot of times is that the people who do want to tear things down, to claim as much of the spoils of society for themselves, they're always working on this stuff. They're always trying to figure out how can we turn people against each other so that we can run away with all the loot. And so people who don't think like that, they kind of fall asleep at the switch a lot of times and then aren't woken up until things are in the darkest moment. It is like, oh no, what's happening? So maybe we're in that process right now. But I know we want to wrap. Any comments before we close this up?
No, I mean, I think it's interesting. I think I appreciate your positivity on this topic because you make me feel warm. You make me feel warm and fuzzy. But
I'm gonna give you something to feel good about, man.
Yeah, well, I'd say this because it's a good point you make about nationalism. Like, that's why I've never been offended by the term "America First," because I do think that does mean something, and it can be something positive. It doesn't have to be negative. Obviously, there's ways it's been manifested to be negative, but I agree with you. And, I just think that, unfortunately, our country, as much as I love it and our culture, we tend to, and I guess kind of like a bad marriage, we tend to not want to discuss the things the baggage that is kind of in that closet, right? And if you just look in that closet and deal with the baggage, probably things will work out for everybody a lot better, but we seem to not want to do that.
Yeah.
And, let's see. Yeah. So I hope you're right.
All right. Well, now, we appreciate everybody for joining us on this part of this episode. We'll have a second part coming out soon as well. So please join us for that as well. Till then, I'm James Keys.
I'm Tunde Ogunlana.
All right. We'll talk soon.